What if I told you the man who wrote almost every hit song by the Cars spent his final days secretly rewriting his will so his wife of nearly 30 years would get nothing? 18 days later, she walked into his bedroom carrying coffee and found him dead. Upstairs sat a legal document accusing her of abandoning him. And suddenly, the story of Ric Ocasek stopped sounding like a rock documentary and started sounding like a mystery. Because for decades, Ric Ocasek looked like a man who had won at life. He wrote songs like Just What I Needed, Drive, and You Might Think. The Cars sold more than 20 million records.
I guess you're just what I needed. Just what I needed. I think it's hysterical. But I know when you're...
MTV loved them. Radio never stopped playing them. Even today, teenagers discover those songs and think they sound newer than half the music coming out now. But the closer people got to Ric, the harder he became to understand. He was born Richard Theodore Ocasek in Baltimore, Maryland in 1944. He was tall, painfully skinny, awkward, and obsessed with electronics. While other kids played sports, Ric sat alone in his basement building amplifiers and teaching himself music chord by chord. Years later, he admitted he once spent months alone just experimenting with piano notes to see which combinations worked. That basement became the blueprint for his entire life. Because even after the fame, the money, and the platinum records, Ric still acted like a guy more comfortable hiding in a dark room than standing in front of a crowd. When his family moved to Cleveland after his father took a NASA job, things got rough fast. On his first day at school, Ric showed up with blonde-dyed hair, which had been popular back in Baltimore. In Ohio, somebody punched him in the face almost immediately. Most people would try harder to fit in after that. Ric leaned harder into being different. He drifted through college, dropped out twice, worked random jobs in steel mills and clothing stores, and kept writing songs nobody had asked for. And here is where it gets wild. Ric later admitted he sometimes started bands for one reason only: to hear his own songs played out loud. Not to become famous, not to impress crowds, just to hear the music exist. Then, in 1965, he met the man who changed everything, a musician named Benjamin Orr. Orr had what Ric did not: charisma, confidence, and a voice people instantly remembered. Ric had the songs. Orr had the sound that could bring them to life. Together, they became unstoppable. But what if I told you the friendship at the center of the Cars would eventually collapse so badly that, near the end, the two men barely spoke at all? For the next decade, Ric Ocasek and Benjamin Orr chased success like two men refusing to admit defeat existed. They formed bands in Ohio, then Boston, then New York. Every time one failed, they started another. Most people quit after a few bad years. These guys kept going for almost 15. And that part matters because by the time the Cars finally became famous, Ric was already in his 30s. He was not some teenage rock prodigy. He was a grown man who had already spent years getting rejected by record labels, playing tiny clubs, and driving home broke. One early band, Milkwood, released an album in 1973 that disappeared almost instantly. Barely anybody bought it. Another group collapsed before getting traction, then another. Same story every time. But Ric never stopped writing. That obsession became almost mechanical. Benjamin Orr once said Ric constantly had new songs ready. Not half-finished ideas, actual songs, melodies, lyrics, arrangements. He heard the music in his head before anybody else did. Then came 1976. Ric finally assembled the lineup that clicked. Elliot Easton on guitar, Greg Hawkes on keyboards, David Robinson on drums, Benjamin Orr on bass and vocals. Robinson suggested the name The Cars because it sounded simple, clean, and modern. Ric immediately loved it. Their first shows were nothing glamorous. One of their earliest performances happened at a military base on New Year's Eve for a crowd that barely cared they existed. But then something happened that changed everything. A demo tape reached Boston radio stations. One song in particular exploded with listeners almost immediately. Just What I Needed. And here's the detail that changed the band forever.
I kinda lose my mind, yeah. It's not the perfume.
Ric wrote the song, but Benjamin Orr sang it. That combination became magic. Ric's detached, hyper-intelligent songwriting, mixed with Orr's warm, emotional voice, created something radio could not resist. Suddenly, club lines wrapped around buildings. Record labels that ignored them for years started calling non-stop. Elektra Records signed them before the end of 1977. But wait, this next part changes everything. Their debut album came out in 1978 and became a monster. It stayed on the Billboard charts for more than 2 years. Songs like My Best Friend's Girl, Good Times Roll, and Just What I Needed were everywhere. The Cars sounded futuristic compared to other rock bands at the time.
It doesn't know the real surprise. Let the good times roll. I guess you're just what I need. Just what I needed.
They mixed sharp guitars with synthesizers and cold new wave production without losing catchy pop hooks. And Ric Ocasek controlled almost all of it. He wrote nearly every song, oversaw arrangements, directed the sound. From the outside, it looked like the perfect setup. Inside the band, things were already getting complicated, because Ric was never fully comfortable being famous. That sounds impossible considering how successful he became, but multiple band members later admitted he seemed embarrassed by celebrity culture. While other rock stars chased attention, Ric acted like somebody forced into the spotlight against his will. He loved recording studios, hated performing, loved writing songs, hated being expected to entertain crowds. Keyboardist Greg Hawkes later admitted Ric probably would have been happier making strange underground experimental music nobody bought instead of hit records everyone loved. And honestly, that explains a lot. Because while the Cars were becoming one of the biggest bands in America, Ric secretly started pulling away from the exact success he created. Between 1978 and 1984, the Cars became almost impossible to escape. Their albums kept going platinum. MTV played their videos constantly. Songs like Shake It Up, Since You're Gone, and you might think turned Ric Ocasek into one of the most successful songwriters in America.
All night, get me around the world. Shake it up, stumble in the shade. Since you're gone, what you put me through? You might think I'm crazy.
But the strangest part of the story is this. The bigger the Cars became, the less Ric seemed to enjoy being in them. He once admitted he did not even think of himself as an entertainer. He hated fake crowd hype. Hated the whole "Hello, Cleveland" rock star act. Other musicians said Ric looked happiest sitting silently in a studio adjusting sounds for hours while everyone else got restless. And here's where it gets wild. At the exact moment the Cars were dominating pop radio, Ric spent his free time producing bands that sounded nothing like the Cars at all. Hardcore punk groups, experimental noise artists, underground acts most mainstream listeners had never even heard of. One of them was Bad Brains, a chaotic hardcore band whose music sounded like it was trying to punch through walls. Another was Suicide, a bizarre electronic duo famous for hostile crowds and terrifying live shows. That was the music Ric actually connected with emotionally, not polished pop stardom. Meanwhile, tension inside the Cars kept quietly building. Because when one person writes almost every song, controls the sound, and becomes the public face of the band, resentment eventually shows up whether people admit it or not. And then came the song that changed Ric's personal life forever, Drive. Released in 1984, it became one of the Cars' biggest hits.
Can't go on thinking.
Benjamin Orr sang lead vocals while Ric wrote the lyrics. The music video featured a 19-year-old supermodel named Polina Poroskova. Ric was 40 years old, and during the filming of that video, they fell for each other almost immediately. At first, almost nobody knew. Ric was still married to his second wife at the time, but behind the scenes, the relationship with Paulina became serious fast. Friends later described them as deeply attached almost from the beginning. From the outside, the pairing made no sense. Paulina was one of the most famous models on earth, young, glamorous, constantly photographed. Ric looked like a guy who wandered out of a basement recording session after not sleeping for 3 days. Tall, skeletal, dressed entirely in black, awkward in interviews, emotionally hard to read. But somehow, it worked, at least for a while. And let me tell you this, the timing could not have been stranger. Because as Ric's new relationship intensified, the Cars themselves started cracking apart. Years of non-stop albums and touring had exhausted everyone. Band members wanted more creative input. Ric kept tightening control. Benjamin Orr, once his closest friend, started drifting away emotionally. Still, the machine kept printing hits. Magic, Why Can't I Have You, Tonight She Comes. From the outside, they looked untouchable.
I know you're getting twisted, and you've been down, just like you. Oh, she jangles me up. She does it with.
But what if I told you the man responsible for all those hits was already preparing mentally for life after the Cars, while the band was still selling millions of records? By the late 1980s, Ric Ocasek had started separating himself from the very thing that made him famous. While the Cars were still huge commercially, Ric was already treating the band like a chapter that was ending, and honestly, the warning signs were everywhere. He released solo music that sounded colder, stranger, and far less commercial than anything the Cars were putting out. Synth-heavy tracks, experimental sounds, beat poetry influences. Music clearly made for himself, not radio. The rest of the band noticed it too, especially Benjamin Orr. For over 20 years, Orr and Ric had functioned almost like two halves of the same machine. Ric wrote the songs. Orr gave many of them emotional life. But now the friendship that built the Cars was quietly fading. Neither man talked publicly about the tension much, which somehow made it feel worse. Then, in 1988, after one final album and tour, the Cars broke up. No dramatic screaming match. No giant public scandal, just exhaustion and distance. The kind of ending that happens when people stop understanding each other long before they stop working together. But wait, because this next chapter becomes incredibly important later. That same year, Ric divorced his second wife. 1 year later, he married Paulina Poriskova in St. Bart's. Suddenly, the awkward kid who spent his childhood alone in a basement was married to one of the most famous supermodels in the world. The image fascinated people. They had 2 sons together and built a life in a massive Manhattan townhouse. Publicly, they looked strangely solid. Paulina constantly defended him in interviews. She described him as brilliant, funny, and deeply sensitive underneath the cold exterior people saw publicly. And for a while, Ric actually seemed calmer, but creatively, he never slowed down. Here is something a lot of people do not realize. Ric Ocasek's second career may have been even more influential than his first. In 1993, a nervous young band from Los Angeles called Weezer reached out asking him to produce their debut album. Frontman Rivers Cuomo practically worshipped the Cars. When Ric walked into the studio for the first meeting, the band secretly played just what I needed to impress him. Ric apparently found it hilarious. And here's where it gets crazy. During recording, Rivers Cuomo wanted to remove a song called Buddy Holly from the album because he thought it sounded too goofy. Ric completely disagreed. For days, Ric left little handwritten notes around the studio saying, "We want Buddy Holly." That song stayed. It became one of the biggest MTV hits of the entire 1990s. Suddenly, Ric Ocasek was not just the architect behind the Cars. He was now shaping the sound of a whole new generation of alternative rock bands. He produced albums for No Doubt, Bad Religion, and more. And nearly everyone who worked with him said the same thing. He was shockingly kind, quiet, humble, encouraging, which makes what happened near the end of his life so difficult to process. Because the man younger musicians described as having the sweetest heart in the industry was eventually going to leave behind a legal document devastating the person closest to him for 3 decades. And nobody saw it coming. For almost 30 years, Paulina Poriskova and Ric Ocasek looked like one of those unlikely celebrity couples that somehow outlasted everybody's expectations. Which is why what happened at the end felt so shocking. Paulina later admitted living with Ric could be incredibly difficult. She described him as controlling, emotionally complicated, and intensely private. At one point, she said he had become the dictator of a very small country. That sounds harsh until you realize multiple people who knew Ric described the exact same thing in different words. Inside the cars, he controlled the music. Inside his home, he controlled the emotional atmosphere too. People close to him often felt they were trying to reach someone who stayed permanently guarded. But Paulina stayed anyway, for decades. And that is what makes the ending hit so hard. In 2018, after nearly 30 years of marriage, they announced they were separating. But even then, the split sounded strangely gentle. They still lived together in the same Manhattan townhouse. Separate bedrooms, same home. Paulina later explained they still cared deeply about each other and were trying to figure out what life looked like after growing apart. At least, that is what she believed. Then came August 28th, 2019. 18 days before his death, Ric secretly changed his will. And here is the exact detail nobody could stop talking about afterward. In the document, he specifically stated Paulina should receive nothing because she had abandoned him. He signed it privately. He never told her. But what if I told you that was not even the most unsettling part? On September 15th, 2019, Paulina brought Ric his morning coffee. When she entered the bedroom, she found him dead. Hypertensive heart disease and emphysema officially caused it. Imagine the emotional whiplash of that moment. First, the shock of finding your husband dead. Then learning he had quietly rewritten his will less than 3 weeks earlier to cut you out completely. After the document became public, the story exploded across entertainment news. People could not reconcile the image. This was the same Ric Ocasek younger musicians called generous and sweet. The same man Paulina had defended publicly for decades. The same guy who spent years avoiding celebrity drama entirely. And suddenly there was this brutal legal statement, waiting after his death, accusing his wife of abandonment. Paulina later admitted the experience shattered her emotionally. She said she felt betrayed and blindsided. Under New York law, surviving spouses are generally entitled to part of an estate regardless of the will. So she challenged it in court. After nearly 2 years of legal proceedings, a settlement was reached. But the emotional damage was already done. And here's where this story becomes even sadder. Near the end of his life, Ric's relationships with several people closest to him had become strained or distant. Benjamin Orr, his longtime musical partner, had already died from pancreatic cancer in 2000 after years of complicated silence between them. Some of Ric's older children were reportedly left out of the will entirely. The man who wrote songs connecting with millions of strangers seemed unable to fully stay connected to the people closest to him. That contradiction became the final shadow hanging over his legacy. In April 2018, the Cars were finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should have felt like a perfect ending. The band reunited one last time. Fans went crazy hearing Just What I Needed, My Best Friend's Girl, and Moving in Stereo performed again. For a moment,
This is just what I needed. I needed someone with some reaction to love. Yes, let's go. She used to be mine.
it almost looked like time had reversed itself. But even there, something felt fragile. Ric Ocasek looked older, thinner, quieter than ever. 14 months later, he was gone. And after his death, people started looking back at his life differently. Not just the music, the man. Because the truth is, Ric Ocasek spent most of his life building walls while writing songs that made millions of people feel understood. That contradiction sits at the center of everything. He could write songs overflowing with emotion, but privately struggle to express it to people closest to him. He could help launch careers for younger bands and become known as one of the kindest producers in rock music, while simultaneously leaving behind a final legal act that devastated his family. Both things were real, and that is what makes the story stick with people. After the Cars ended, Ric kept releasing solo albums, poetry, and experimental projects that barely touched the charts. He did not seem bothered by fading mainstream attention. In some ways, he almost looked relieved by it. Fame never appeared to satisfy him the way creating did. That basement kid never disappeared. Even after the platinum albums and MTV success, Ric still seemed most comfortable alone, experimenting with sounds, chasing ideas nobody else could hear yet. And honestly, maybe that was always the problem. Because the skills that make someone brilliant creatively do not always help them emotionally. The obsessive focus, the isolation, the need for control. Those traits helped Rick build one of the most influential catalogs in rock history. They also seem to make closeness incredibly difficult. Benjamin Orr died in 2000 after pancreatic cancer. Near the end, the friendship between the two men had reportedly grown distant and complicated. Greg Hawkes later admitted there were still parts of Rick he never fully understood even after knowing him for decades. That says a lot. This was a man surrounded by people for most of his adult life, who still somehow remained mysterious to almost everybody around him. And yet, the music survived all of it. That is the strange part. The songs outlived the arguments, outlived the lawsuits, outlived the broken friendships and unanswered questions. Turn on classic rock radio right now, and you will probably hear one within an hour. Drive still sounds emotional. You might think it still sounds futuristic. Just What I Needed still sounds like the start of summer. The work stayed young even as the people behind it grew older, complicated, and eventually disappeared. And maybe that is the real story here. Not whether Ric Ocasek was right or wrong. Not whether the will was cruel or justified. Not even whether fame made him unhappy. It is this. A man spent his entire life searching for connection through music while struggling to maintain it everywhere else. He wrote more than 20 million records worth of songs people still love, decades later. But underneath all the success, all the acclaim, all the influence, he may never have stopped being that lonely teenager in a basement, sitting in the dark, testing piano chords one note at a time just to see if they worked. And maybe that is why the music still feels so human.